The hospital telegram arrived on a Tuesday. It was brief, brutal. Regret to inform you, Eleanor lost in childbirth. The child, a son, also perished. My world ended in that moment. For 3 months I was a ghost, haunting the halls of the home we had built together, surrounded by the relentless silence of my grief. Then on a business trip to a distant city I stopped at a simple flower cart, and I saw her, my Eleanor, alive, buying roses. Our eyes met for a single, earth-shattering second before she was hurried into a waiting carriage by a man in a doctor's coat. She was a ghost made flesh. And in that moment I knew nothing, not the hospital, not my own eyes at her graveside, had been real. This is the story of what I discovered, a conspiracy of life and death that would lead me into the heart of a gilded cage, where the wealthy trade fortunes for stolen lives. The world had become a monochrome painting for Arthur Pendleton. 3 months since the telegram from the prestigious Havenwood Sanitarium, 3 months since the vibrant colors of his life had been bleached away, leaving only shades of gray. His wife, Eleanor, with her laugh that could brighten a stormy day and her spirit as fierce as it was kind, was gone. The doctor's words had been a clinical, final verdict, a sudden, catastrophic hemorrhage. There had been no chance for a final goodbye. He had stood at her graveside, the rain mingling with the tears on his face, a hollowed-out shell of the man he had been. Their son, the heir to his modest shipping empire, buried with her. The nursery in their Boston townhouse remained locked, a tomb within a tomb. Business, his father had insisted, was the only antidote to grief. And so, Arthur found himself in the bustling, unfamiliar city of New York, meeting with investors whose faces and names blurred into one another. It was on his way to yet another interminable lunch that he saw her. He was crossing the street, his head down against the chill wind, when a splash of color caught his eye, a flower cart overflowing with crimson roses. And there, standing before it, was a woman. She wore a simple dove-gray dress, not the fine silks Eleanor would have chosen, but the way she stood, the delicate curve of her neck as she inclined her head to smell a bloom. It was a pose he had seen 1,000 times in his own garden. His breath hitched, a cruel trick of the mind, he thought, a phantom conjured by a heart that refused to heal. Then she turned. Time stopped. The clamor of the city, the clatter of carriage wheels, the shouts of newsboys faded into a distant hum. It was Eleanor. Her face was paler, thinner, etched with a deep, unnameable exhaustion, but it was her. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, met his. In that single, searing second, he saw not recognition, but a dawning, terrified awareness. Her lips parted not in his name, but in a silent gasp. Before he could move, before he could form a single syllable, a man was at her side. He was tall, dressed in the immaculate, authoritative coat of a physician, his face sharp and unsmiling. He took Eleanor firmly by the arm, his grip possessive, and with a glance of pure venom at Arthur, he hurried her towards a polished black carriage waiting at the curb. Eleanor, the name was torn from Arthur's throat, a raw, desperate sound. She looked back once, her eyes wide with a plea he could not decipher, before the doctor shoved her inside and slammed the door. The carriage lurched into the flow of traffic, disappearing around a corner. Arthur stood frozen in the middle of the street, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of roses was suddenly cloying, suffocating. The world, which had been gray for so long, was now spinning, tilting on its axis. She was alive. The hospital had lied. The grave was empty. And the man who had taken her looked at him not with the sympathy of a caregiver, but the fury of a thief caught in the act. Grief was instantly incinerated by a white-hot fury. He would tear the city apart. He would find her. And he would learn why the world had been made to believe that Eleanor Pendleton was dead. The journey back to Boston was a fever dream. Arthur paced the private train car, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories and burning questions. The look in her eyes, it wasn't just fear. It was a warning, a plea for him to stay away, even as his very soul screamed to find her. His first stop was not his cold, empty house, but the cemetery. He stood before the elegant marble headstone, a monument to a lie. Beloved wife and mother asterisk. The words were a mockery. With a resolve forged in betrayal, he went to the cemetery's office, using his name, his wealth, his barely contained rage to demand the truth. The groundskeeper, a grizzled old man named Mr. Higgins, was reluctant. "Mr. Pendleton, sir, it's not right to disturb the dead." "I need to know what is in that coffin," Arthur growled. The civility he'd been raised with stripped away. Money, as it often did, loosened tongues and morals. Under the cover of a moonless night, with only the light of a single lantern, Mr. Higgins and his nephew dug. The sound of their shovels hitting wood was a dull, final thud. Arthur's heart clenched. Had he gone mad? Had the flower cart been a hallucination born of unbearable grief? They pried the lid open. The lantern light fell upon the interior. Arthur stared, his breath plumbing in the cold air. The coffin was filled with sandbags. There was no body, no trace of Eleanor, no tiny swaddled form of his son. It was a prop, a stage piece in a macabre play designed for him, the sole grieving audience. The rage that filled him was colder now, more focused. This was not a simple mistake. This was a meticulously planned deception. He thought of the Havenwood Sanitarium, its gleaming white facade a symbol of modern medical excellence and discretion for Boston's elite. It was a fortress of secrets. He returned to his home and went straight to Eleanor's writing desk. He rifled through her letters, her diaries, looking for any clue, any unease she might have expressed in the weeks before the birth. He found nothing. But as he ran his hands over the smooth walnut, his fingers found a hidden catch, a secret compartment she had shown him once, laughing, where she kept his most romantic letters. The compartment was empty except for a single, folded piece of paper. It was not his writing. It was a list, written in a precise, unfamiliar hand. It contained names, dates, and staggering sums of money. At the top of the list was a name that made his blood run cold, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was the chief obstetrician at Havenwood, the man who had signed the death certificate, the man who had held Arthur's hand, his face a mask of somber regret, and told him he had done all he could. Arthur Pendleton was no longer a grieving widower. He was a hunter, and he now had his prey. The Havenwood Sanitarium stood on a manicured hill overlooking the city, a sprawling edifice of white marble and gleaming windows that promised restoration and peace. To Arthur, it now looked like a beautifully crafted prison. He presented himself at the reception, not as a bereaved husband, but as a potential patron, a wealthy shipping magnate interested in making a sizable donation to their noble work. He was received with unctuous warmth by the administrator, a Mr. Sterling, who gave him a grand tour. They walked through sun-drenched solariums and quiet libraries, past rooms where women in crisp linen robes read or embroidered. It was all perfectly serene, perfectly staged. Arthur's eyes, however, were searching for something else. He noted the heavy locks on the doors leading to the west wing, the subtle presence of large, orderly-like attendants who stood with a vigilance that spoke of something other than care. "And this is our maternity ward," Mr. Sterling said, gesturing down a particularly well-guarded corridor. "We pride ourselves on the most modern techniques and absolute discretion for our distinguished families." "My wife, my late wife," Arthur said, the words still ash in his mouth. "She spoke so highly of Dr. Finch. I should like to meet the man who cared for her so diligently." A flicker of something, unease, crossed Mr. Sterling's face. "Ah, Dr. Finch is a very busy man. His schedule is—" "I insist," Arthur said, his voice dropping, layering the quiet threat of withheld wealth beneath the polite request. "It would bring me great comfort." The power of potential money worked its magic. He was led to an opulent office where Dr. Alistair Finch sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was exactly as Arthur remembered, impeccably dressed, his hair silvered at the temples, his gaze intelligent and unnervingly direct. "Mr. Pendleton," Finch said, rising and extending a hand. His grip was firm, dry. "A tragic loss. Please accept my renewed condolences." Arthur took the seat offered, his every sense screaming. This was the man who had looked him in the eye and lied. "Thank you, doctor. I find myself seeking answers. The nature of the complication, it was all so sudden." Finch steepled his fingers. "Childbirth is a precarious business, even for the healthiest of women. A uterine atony, I'm afraid. There was nothing anyone could do. It was, as they say, in God's hands." "And you are the one who speaks for God in this place," Arthur thought. He kept his expression a mask of sorrowful acceptance. "I see. And the child?" A tragedy upon a tragedy. He was simply too fragile. As Finch spoke, Arthur's sharp eyes scanned the office. On a shelf behind the doctor, nestled between medical texts, was a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of Dr. Finch, smiling, his arm around a woman. The woman was turned slightly away, but the profile, the way her hair was styled, it was the woman from the flower cart. It was Eleanor. Arthur felt a jolt so violent he feared he might be sick. This was not just a medical cover-up. The man who had stolen his wife had a personal, possessive connection to her. He made a hasty exit, his mind reeling. He needed a way inside this gilded cage. He needed an ally. And as he stumbled out into the crisp air, his thoughts turned to the one person Eleanor had always trusted. Her younger sister, Clara, a woman with a fiery spirit and a keen mind who had never quite believed the official story. It was time to stop hunting alone. Clara Vance was not a woman who accepted convenient truths. When Arthur arrived at her modest boarding house, her face, so like her sister, but etched with a sharper, more skeptical intelligence, was pale with a tension that had been there for months. "I knew it," she whispered, her hands trembling as Arthur told her of the flower cart, the empty coffin, the photograph in Finch's office. Her eyes, the same summer sky blue as Eleanor's, blazed with a furious light. "I told you, Arthur. I told you there was something wrong. The way they rushed us out, the way they wouldn't let me see her, I felt it." "I was blinded by grief, Clara," Arthur admitted, the confession painful. "I am sorry I did not listen." There was no time for recriminations. They were united by a single, burning purpose: get Eleanor back. Clara, with her boldness, provided the plan. "They need staff. They're always hearing nurses, aides. I can get in. I can be your eyes and ears inside." Arthur vehemently opposed it. "It's too dangerous. If Finch recognized you—" "He never met me," Clara countered. "Eleanor kept her family life separate from that world. I can do this. I'm the only one who can." Reluctantly, armed with forged references provided by a discreet contact of Arthur, Clara applied and was accepted for a position at Havenwood. Her reports, smuggled out by a sympathetic kitchen maid Arthur had bribed, painted a chilling picture. The West Wing, the maternity ward, was a world unto itself. Patients there were rarely seen in the common areas. They were described as delicate, requiring absolute rest. The doors were always locked. Meanwhile, Arthur used his wealth and influence to investigate Dr. Finch's background. He discovered a brilliant man from a once wealthy family that had lost its fortune. Finch had rebuilt his status not through inheritance, but through his practice, catering exclusively to the ultra-rich. And there were whispers, buried deep in financial records, of a private trust fund, a fortune that seemed to have no clear source. A week after Clara started, her note was more urgent. "I saw her, Arthur, in the West Wing garden during their prescribed airing. She is thin, so very thin, and she walks like she is in a dream. But it is her. She is here. Room 214. Eleanor was alive. She was a prisoner in room 214. The relief was so profound it brought Arthur to his knees. But it was immediately followed by a colder, more terrifying realization. They were keeping her for a reason. And men like Alistair Finch did not go to such elaborate lengths without a plan for what happened next. The rescue was no longer an abstract goal. It was a mission that required a perfect, precise strike. And they had to act before Eleanor, the vibrant woman they both loved, was lost to them forever, not by death, but by design. The world had shrunk to the size of a room. Room 214. Eleanor Pendleton moved through her days in a sedated haze, a marionette whose strings were pulled by the doses of tonic Dr. Finch personally administered. Her memories were a fractured mosaic. Searing pain, Alistair's cold eyes where Arthur's warm ones should have been, the crushing emptiness in her arms where her baby should have been. He had told her the child, a son, had died. He had told her Arthur, crushed by grief, had abandoned her, signed her over to the sanitarium's care. She was an embarrassment, a broken thing to be hidden away. She wanted not to believe it, but the drugs and the relentless, gaslit isolation wore her down. Her fiery spirit was being systematically smothered. Until she saw Clara. It was during her daily supervised walk in the high-walled West Wing garden. A new aide was tending the rose bushes. She looked up, and for a fleeting second their eyes met. It was a jolt of lightning to Eleanor's numbed soul. Clara. Her sister gave no sign of recognition, her face a careful mask of professional detachment. But as she brushed past, her whisper was a ghost in the air, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. "Arthur knows. He's coming. Be ready." The words were a key turning in a rusted lock. Arthur knows. He hadn't abandoned her. He was coming. A tiny, defiant flame sparked to life within her. She clung to it, fanning it in the silent, lonely hours, using it to fight the fog of the tonic she now secretly began to spit into her handkerchief. Her senses sharpened. She noticed the patterns. The way Nurse Thorpe's keys jangled on her belt, the specific footstep of the night orderly, a heavy, lumbering tread, the faint, rhythmic wail of another patient down the hall, a sound she now understood as pure, unadulterated terror, not madness. She was not a patient, she was a commodity. She had overheard snippets of conversation between Finch and the administrator, Sterling, words like legacy, donor, and the Sinclair Project. They were not just hiding her, they were using her. The realization was more terrifying than any thought of death. One evening, as Dr. Finch made his rounds, his manner was different, almost celebratory. "You are progressing wonderfully, Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Soon, we will be able to move you to a more permanent arrangement, a quiet country estate, far from the painful memories of your past life." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air swept through her. A permanent arrangement sounded like a finality from which there would be no return, a final, gilded tomb. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring at the high, spiked fence that separated her from the world. Arthur was coming, but would he be in time? The carefully constructed walls of her prison were no longer just physical, they were temporal, closing in with every tick of the clock on her mantelpiece. She had to be ready. She had to find a way to fight back. Arthur's plan was a desperate, moonlit gamble. Clara's final, smuggled note had been a single, stark sentence. "Finch plans to move her in 2 days. You must come tonight." The cover of darkness was their only ally. Arthur, dressed in dark clothes, met Clara at a prearranged spot behind the sanitarium's carriage house. She had stolen a key, but it only opened the service entrance to the west wing. The rest was up to brute force and sheer audacity. "The night orderly is a man named Briggs," Clara whispered, her face pale but determined in the faint light. "He sits at a desk at the end of the hall. He's large, but he dozes off after his midnight whiskey." They slipped inside, the door closing behind them with a soft, terrifying click. The corridor was long and dim, smelling of antiseptic and boiled cabbage. As predicted, the hulking Briggs was slumped in his chair, his head lolling on his chest. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps silent on the polished floor. Room 214. Arthur's hand trembled as he took the key from Clara. This was it, the moment of truth. He turned the lock. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a single nightlight. And there, standing by the window, fully dressed in a simple traveling suit she had fashioned from her few allowed possessions, was Eleanor. She was not the sedated, broken woman he had feared. Her eyes were clear, blazing with a familiar fire, though shadowed by months of trauma. For a heartbeat they simply stared at each other, the chasm of lost time stretching between them. Then, a single, tear-tracked smile broke across her face. "Arthur." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She felt fragile, bird-like, but her arms around him were strong. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent that had haunted his dreams. "My love," he choked out. "I'm here. I'm so sorry." There was no time for a longer reunion. A floorboard creaked out in the hall. They froze. Briggs was awake. His heavy footsteps approached. "Who's there?" his gruff voice called. Clara acted. She stepped out into the hall. "It's just me, Mr. Briggs, Nurse Vance. I'm checking on Mrs. Smith." "At this hour?" he grumbled, suspicious. As Clara distracted him, Arthur took Eleanor's hand. "We have to go now." They slipped out of the room and began to move down the corridor, away from the service entrance, towards a secondary staircase Clara had identified. But as they reached the stairwell, a calm, cold voice stopped them. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Pendleton?" Dr. Alistair Finch stood at the top of the stairs, blocking their path. He held a small but deadly Derringer pistol, its barrel aimed squarely at Arthur's chest. His face was a mask of icy fury. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you to take my patient. She is very, very ill." They were trapped. The hulking Briggs was behind them, and an armed, ruthless Finch was in front. Arthur tightened his grip on Eleanor's hand, his mind racing for a way out, any way out, of the nightmare he had just walked into. The dimly lit stairwell became a courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of fear and the oil from Finch's pistol. "She is not your patient," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is my wife. You stole her. You lied to me. You told me my son was dead." A cruel, triumphant smile touched Finch's lips. "But he is dead, Mr. Pendleton. A tragic stillbirth. A fact I documented meticulously." Eleanor's gasp was a sharp, pained thing. She clung to Arthur's arm, her body trembling. "You're a monster." "I am a visionary," Finch snapped, his composure cracking to reveal the fanaticism beneath. "You see a wife. I see the perfect vessel. Your wife, Mr. Pendleton, comes from a remarkable bloodline, rare, robust, free of the decadent weaknesses that plague our so-called elite. My benefactors, the Sinclairs, lost their daughter-in-law. Their lineage was at an end. They required a replacement, a healthy, presentable woman to bear their heir and secure their fortune. Your grief provided the perfect opportunity." The horrifying truth unfurled before Arthur. It wasn't just about hiding a living person. It was about repurposing her. Eleanor was to be erased and reborn as someone else, her very identity and motherhood stolen to serve a richer, more powerful family. "And the child?" Arthur demanded, a new, more terrible fear gripping him. "The Sinclair heir thrives," Finch said smugly. "Raised by a doting, grateful mother in a palace overlooking the Hudson. He will never know the name Pendleton." The revelation was a physical blow. Their son was alive. He had been stolen and given to another family. The injustice of it was so vast it stole the air from Arthur's lungs. It was Clara, thinking quickly, who created their only chance. From the shadows behind Briggs, she gave a sharp, desperate cry. "Fire! Fire in the linen closet!" The word fire in a place full of flammable materials and trapped, sedated patients was a potent weapon. Briggs, his instincts overruling his orders, spun around in a panic, his attention diverted. In that split second, Arthur moved. He shoved Eleanor behind him and lunged at Finch. The derringer went off with a deafening crack in the confined space, the bullet embedding itself in the wall beside Arthur's head. He slammed into the doctor, driving him back against the banister. They grappled for the weapon, a brutal, silent struggle of grunts and straining muscles. Finch was strong, fueled by a desperate madness, but Arthur was powered by a righteous fury for his wife, his stolen son, and the months of stolen life. He drove his fist into Finch's jaw. The doctor's head snapped back and his grip on the pistol loosened. Arthur wrenched it from his hand and sent it clattering down the stairs. He turned, grabbing Eleanor's hand again. "Now." With Briggs distracted and Finch dazed, they fled down the stairs, Clara right behind them. They burst out into the cool, free night air, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm of terror and triumph. They had escaped the gilded cage, but the fight was far from over. They had the truth, but they had lost a son, and a man like Alistair Finch would not let his life's work be destroyed without a fight. The Pendleton townhouse, once a tomb of grief, became a fortress and a command center. Arthur installed the most discreet and loyal private security money could buy. Eleanor, though physically free, was a ghost in her own home, haunted by the memory of the child she had carried and lost twice over, first to a lie, and now to a cruel, gilded reality. The story they had to tell was so fantastical, so monstrous, that taking it to the conventional authorities was a risk. Finch was a respected pillar of the medical community. The Sinclairs were an empire of old money and political influence. It would be their word against a meticulously constructed web of lies. Arthur's vengeance, therefore, would not be delivered in a courtroom, but in the shadowy arena where men like Finch and Sinclair truly lived, the realm of reputation and wealth. He began with a targeted, ruthless campaign. Using his extensive business contacts, he started to quietly unravel Sinclair's financial empire. He outbid them on crucial shipping contracts, leaked damaging information about their railroad investments to rival newspapers, and used his influence to have their banking practices scrutinized. It was a financial siege, designed to make the mighty Sinclair family bleed. Simultaneously, he directed his investigators to dig into every aspect of Dr. Finch's life. They found the other women, families of other deceased patients from wealthy but less powerful families, women whose deaths had been similarly sudden, and whose husbands had been quickly consoled by Finch's smooth explanations. He had been running his grotesque operation for years. Arthur invited these grieving, suspicious men to his home. He let Eleanor, her presence the most damning evidence of all, tell her story. The room of powerful, heartbroken men listened, their grief turning into a cold, collective rage. They had been pawns in Finch's game, their wives and their legacies stolen. The final blow came not from Arthur, but from a broken Briggs, the orderly, who was offered a small fortune to confess everything he knew about the West Wing, the sedations, and the late-night adoptions. His signed affidavit, combined with the collective weight of the other families, created a story that could no longer be suppressed. They didn't go to the police. They went to the most powerful newspaper in Boston, presenting a case so airtight and scandalous it promised to be the story of the decade. The downfall was swift and merciless. The headlines were brutal. Havenwood horrors, the gilded grave of Boston's elite. Dr. Alistair Finch, angel of death or devil in white. The Sinclair name was dragged through the mud, their fortune evaporating in the glare of public outrage and financial sabotage. Finch was arrested not for murder, but for fraud, forgery, and a litany of other charges that would see him spend the rest of his life in a dark, dank cell, a world away from the sanitized opulence of his sanitarium. The gilded cage had finally claimed its architect. Justice had been served, but for Arthur and Eleanor standing together in their quiet home, it felt like a hollow victory. The world knew their story. The monster was in chains, but a piece of their hearts was still missing, living a life of luxury under a different name, in a mansion on the Hudson. The Sinclair mansion was a cold, classical revival palace of white marble, a monument to old money and austere power. It stood on a bluff, overlooking the river, its grandeur feeling more like a prison than a home. Arthur and Eleanor stood at its imposing wrought iron gate, their hands clasped tightly together. They had come not with lawyers or policemen, but as parents. They were shown into a cavernous drawing room by a stern-faced butler. Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair were there, an elderly couple whose wealth was etched into the haughty lines of their faces. But beneath the arrogance, Arthur saw something else: fear. Their world had crumbled around them. Their name was synonymous with scandal, their fortune decimated. And in a bassinet by the window slept a baby, a boy. He had a dusting of fair hair, and as he stirred, he opened eyes the same summer sky blue as Eleanor's. A sound, half sob, half cry, escaped Eleanor's lips. She took an involuntary step forward, her entire being straining toward the child. "That is our grandson," Mr. Sinclair said, his voice thin but defiant. "James Sinclair." "His name is Theodore," Eleanor whispered, the name she and Arthur had chosen a lifetime ago. "Theodore Arthur Pendleton." What followed was not a confrontation but a devastating negotiation. The Sinclairs had raised the boy from infancy. He was the center of their shattered world, the last vessel of their legacy. They pleaded, they offered what was left of their fortune, they threatened. But looking at the child, Arthur and Eleanor faced an impossible choice. They could take him. The law, public opinion, everything was on their side. They could reclaim their son, rip him from the only home, the only parents he had ever known. It would be their right, but it would also be an act of profound violence against an innocent child. Eleanor knelt by the bassinet, her tears falling freely now. She did not touch him, only watched him sleep, her love for him a tangible force in the room. She saw the security, the opulence, the desperate, possessive love the Sinclairs had for him. She stood and turned to Arthur, her eyes filled with an anguish that would never fully heal. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "We will not take him," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. The words cost him a part of his soul. Relief flooded the Sinclairs' faces, followed by confusion. "But," Arthur continued, his gaze hardening, "these are our terms. You will leave Boston, you will live quietly, and you will never ever hide the truth from him. He will know his story. He will know he has another family who loves him, and we will be a part of his life, on our terms." It was not the victory they had dreamed of. It was a compromise forged in the cruel reality of their circumstances. They walked out of the mansion without their son in their arms, but with a fragile, painful promise for the future. The wound of his absence would never fully close, but it would no longer be a festering secret. It would be a managed grief, a love expressed from a respectful, necessary distance. A year later, spring had returned to Boston. The Pendleton townhouse was no longer a fortress or a tomb, but a home, filled with light and the subtle, enduring scent of roses from the garden. The scars of the past were still there, visible in the occasional shadow that crossed Eleanor's eyes, in the way Arthur would sometimes reach for her in the night, as if to reassure himself she was real. But they were healing. Eleanor had founded a charity, an organization dedicated to helping the families of missing persons, using her own harrowing experience to guide others through the labyrinth of grief and doubt. In helping them, she found a purpose that fortified her own spirit. Arthur, his business empire stronger than ever, had become a different man. Softer, more present, his priorities forever shifted. The greatest treasure was not in a ledger book, but in the woman who sat beside him each evening, her hand in his. They had visited the house on the Hudson several times. They were Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Arthur to the little boy, who was toddling now with a joyful, infectious laugh. The visits were bittersweet, a complex tapestry of love and loss, but they were a promise kept. He would know them. He would know the truth. On this particular morning, Arthur found Eleanor in the garden, tending to the rose bushes, her hands now steady and sure in the soil. The ghost of the flower cart had been laid to rest. She was not a memory to be mourned, but a woman, fully alive. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into his embrace, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "He has your smile," she said softly, speaking of the son they would never truly have but would never truly lose. "And your eyes," Arthur replied, holding her tighter. Their story had not ended with a perfect storybook resolution. There was no reclaiming the lost year, no undoing the theft of their child's infancy. But as they stood together, watching the sun climb higher, bathing their garden in gold, they had found something else. A love that had been tested by fire and betrayal, and had emerged not broken but reforged, stronger and more resilient. They had not gotten everything back, but they had reclaimed their future. And for the first time since the telegram arrived on a Tuesday, the future looked not like a burden, but like a dawn worth greeting together.